Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Mind Forest podcast, where we discuss third perspectives on philosophy, mental health and associated topics. We've got some really interesting guests coming up from quite a diverse range of disciplines and fields, and I'm really excited to share that with you. But today we're coming with a solo episode, and today will be part 1 of me discussing Taoism and mental health. So 2 concepts that I feel go hand in hand, complement each other quite well. And today I'll just be diving into part 1 of this discussion, where we're going to lay out some fundamentals of Taoism, quickly define mental health, and then talk through a few themes within Taoism that I feel can be really beneficial towards our mental health. So I will be relying on my book in this episode. So I have written a very accessible and simple book called Eastern Philosophy, a Handbook for Beginners. I will leave that in the show notes. Let's dive in. So I think what would be useful first would be for me to just lay out what we mean by Taoism and what we mean by mental health. Okay, so let's start with mental health. I think it's a term, it's a concept that fortunately has become much more used and familiar in today's society. However, I think I just mentioned that when we talk about mental health, I think it often triggers thoughts of poor mental health or pathologized forms of mental health. So, we might think about anxiety, depression, even more severe symptoms like post-traumatic stress disorder. However, I think it's important to remember that mental health is a spectrum, and it's a concept that we all have relation to. Okay, we can have good mental health or poor mental health. And you often hear people saying things like, I had mental health, as if that was a description of their poor mental health. So, just it's worth bearing that in mind. And it's worth bearing in mind that we won't be focusing on any super specifically, defined forms of mental health disorders in today's chat. And this is not an academic chat, and it's not a chat that is geared towards professional mental health. It's really geared towards the concept of mental health from a wide scope. Okay, and so we can take the Oxford definition of mental health, which is a person's condition with regard to their psychological and emotional well-being. So I'll just repeat that: it's a person's condition with regard to their psychological and emotional well-being. Okay, so nice easy concept. I think it's quite common sense. We all can relate to our well-being around emotions and around our psychology. Psychology is a concept we could unpack further, but for now, let's just leave it as the science of human behavior. Okay, how our brains relate to how we think and act. So now we've defined mental health, let's talk about Taoism. So many of you will have heard of Taoism, others may not have heard of Taoism. I think the easiest thing is for me to just simply read the introduction from my book to you. So let's do that. There was something formless and perfect before the universe was born. For lack of a better name, I call it the Tao. Tao Te Ching, verse 1. So Taoism is both a spiritual tradition and a philosophy traced back to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is an honorary name meaning ancient sage or master, and his given name was said to be Li. So there's debate around when he lived. He's often said to be a contemporary of Confucius, so around the 6th century BC, although this ranges towards the 4th century BC. Taoism is characterized by a subtle, mystical approach to life and is inspired by the constant change and interdependent opposites of nature. So nature is a really key theme within Taoism. The central text of Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, and this is the Book of the Way. It is a collection of sayings written in a mystical and poetic style. Lao Tzu is traditionally thought of as the author of the Tao Te Ching, although there is debate as to whether it was all written by him. And there's even debate as to whether he even existed or was just a mythical figure. As with many of these figures in the past, evidence can be lost and it can be tricky to define things. However, either way, the book was written and it's had such a profound impact on Eastern philosophy and the Eastern world and now the West, and it's come to define its own religion, idea, philosophy, way of life, and is considered to be one of the 2 major native philosophies of China alongside Confucianism. And in Chinese philosophy is often spoken, there are 3 jewels, which is Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. So Buddhism travelled to China from India. However, Taoism very much sits within that group of philosophies. So Taoism is a mixture of many schools of thought and traditions which predate Lao Tzu and were developed after him. So scholars trace the roots of Taoism to hermits and sages who were mentioned in various other texts, such as the Analects of Confucianism. So these hermits and sages were spiritual philosophers who lived reclusively and were thought of as sort of keepers of wisdom in ancient China. So the religious aspect of Taoism is the applied philosophy mixed with beliefs, many which are cultural, and precede Taoism about the nature of the universe, including aspects of astrology, medicine, and cosmology. The spiritual practice of Taoism may be said to be the application of the ideas that are supported by the key texts. And it's difficult to completely separate philosophy from spirituality because ultimately they come from the same source in Taoism. But here we'll do our best to focus on the ideas, on the philosophy of Taoism. Not to say that the practices and the spirituality are not important. They certainly are, and we will touch on them. It's just, I think it's important to lay out that I'm not claiming to have a sociological or cultural understanding of Taoism in any large sense. Although I still believe you can engage with the ideas in a healthy way. So that's what we're doing today. So the word Tao is worth some reflection. The word is central to ancient and modern Chinese thought and is not actually unique to Taoism. The word is roughly translated to way. Way is an apt translation as it's broad enough to cover the many meanings of Tao, whilst also acknowledging that there can be many different ways. So other translations are path or road. The sense is that Tao encapsulates the idea of a route or a journey that must be followed, that must be experienced, and is not just an intellectual concept. And I think that will be really key as we move forward in the discussion. Okay, so let's talk about the basics of the Tao. So explaining the Tao is a difficult task. It's a mysterious concept at best, and it's no coincidence that the first two lines of the Tao Te Ching warn us against trying to name or define it. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So that's Tao Te Ching, verse 1. So it's not clear that the Tao is something you can really know. Moreover, it's something you can live or experience. So as we've mentioned, Tao can be translated to road or way, and it's often described as flowing through all things. So it's a subtle concept that cannot be intellectually grasped. And Lao Tzu's keen to emphasize that Taoism is a lived philosophy. So in verse 70, he tells us, "My teachings are easy to understand and easy to put into practice, but your intellect will never grasp them." So just think about that for a moment. There's a philosophy here we often think as mystical, and we're being told it's easy to understand, it's easy to put into practice, but we will never be able to really intellectually grasp it. So I think many Westerners might have an issue with that, but let's move on and see how that unfolds. So Tao is not exactly a god, however it is said to support and precede the universe, which are two qualities often associated with divine beings. It's maybe better to think of it as a fundamental energy or force that is inherent in all things in the universe and is the cause of them all, although it cannot be defined on its own. So Tao Te Ching verse 21 tells us, "Since before time and space were, the Tao is. It is beyond and it is not. In the beginning was the Tao. All things issue from it, all things return to it." Tao Te Ching 25. So we get the sense here that the Tao is extratemporal. It exists outside of time, although it also flows through all things, so it exists within time, within the universe. So again, quite a difficult concept to understand, and perhaps we never will. The good news is we can experience it because we are part of nature. We are part of the Tao in a very fundamental sense. So the Tao Te Ching reads a bit like a book of poetry. The wording is such that you could read one verse many times and each time understand it in different contexts. So I think you'll have gathered that from the verses I just read you. We could probably do whole podcasts just unpacking one verse. The Tao Te Ching refers largely to universal principles and as I've mentioned, has a particular focus on nature, impermanence, opposites, and how best to live. So there's an introduction to Taoism and where it sits within Chinese philosophy and some of the basic concepts contained within. So now we'll move on to discussing some different themes within Taoism and how I believe they relate or can relate to mental health and actually improving our mental health. So the first of these is desire. So the first theme is desire. So desire is a really prevalent theme throughout Eastern philosophy and in many different Eastern philosophies, from Buddhism to Jainism to Hinduism. Desire is seen as a hurdle, as something we must overcome, something that keeps us trapped to this earthly realm. Okay. Within the Tao Te Ching, desire is also seen as something we must overcome or at least let go of, might be a better way of describing it. Just to lay it out, within the Tao Te Ching, the term yu is the Romanized translation is used, and this translation means something like want, desire, wish, or craving. It's important to note that Chinese is a logographic language. It's not a phonetic language like the European languages. So one symbol can have many different meanings within it. Okay, so within the Tao Te Ching, although the same symbol is used, different scholars have been able to kind of say there's two different types of desire that are laid out. Okay, the first is sensual desires, and these are desires that can never be satisfied. So things like desiring bodily pleasures or drugs or food or money. These are sensual desires that we look forward to, and these can be distinguished from what we might call natural desires or needs, like needing to eat or to drink or to take care of your children, things like that. So that distinction is really important, and I think for the ease of us being English speakers, we should rename these two types of desire. We can call one needs, so the natural needs that are in accordance with nature, and the other type we can call craving. And I prefer the translation of craving because I think it gives more of a description to the type of unnatural or unhelpful desires that the Tao Te Ching primarily focuses on. So that's a distinction. So, free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Tao Te Ching, verse 1. So as with Buddhism, aversion to desire is a central concept in Taoist thought, and desire is understood as a mental state that is incompatible with peace and balance. Tao Te Ching, verse 37 tells us, when there is no desire, all things are at peace. So to grasp the mystery of the Tao, one must first be free from the desire to seek it. This, though, may seem a paradox. How can somebody understand something without the desire to understand? But it's not as illogical as it seems. For example, take the process of unconsciously learning a skill. A child may learn how to ride a bike one day just by following their parents without having any knowledge or desire to do so previously. It's just a flowing process that their brain automatically picks up. So in the same way, we can experience the Tao without desire to do so. Tao Te Ching verse 44 tells us, be content with what you have, rejoice in the way things are, and when you realize nothing is lacking, the whole world belongs to you. Lao Tzu thought that the living in a constant state of desire and yearning for the future or for external things is the antithesis of living with the Tao. Therefore, one had to let go of desire and be at ease with the way things are in order to live optimally. So a few reflections there in relation to mental health. The first I would focus on would be cognitive overload. So cognitive overload is something we all experience, especially in the modern world, and it's when we're just simply bombarded with too many tasks or too much information for our brain to retain at any one given point. And for many of us to work optimally in our jobs or just navigate the world, I believe we have to be really conscious of the amount of energy we're allowing our brain, our cognition to give out. So a really good analogy I've heard elsewhere is like, if you imagine you have a blue orb of energy at the beginning of the day in your brain, and this gets slowly shrunk throughout the day. And It might just be checking the screen here, looking at an advertisement there. But every single piece of cognitive load will slightly reduce that orb. And cognitive overload is something I've definitely experienced. So symptoms include difficulty concentrating, poor decision making, forgetfulness, fatigue, and decreased productivity. And I guess it's we can think of it this way. Craving leads us to be constantly processing images and thoughts which are not based in our current reality. So if we're walking to work and we're thinking about the food we want to get when we're at work, we're thinking about goals we want to achieve when we're at our job, we're thinking about which train we want to get when we come home. All of these future thoughts are taking us away from the moment. But not only that, they're just slightly adding to the cognitive load on our brain. Okay, so Taoism is all about using the right amount of energy at any given time, not using too much energy. So there's so many reasons we're cognitively overloaded in the modern world. Desire is certainly not the only one, but I feel that if we're able to reduce the amount of future thoughts, future wishes, future cravings we have, we'll certainly be able to reduce cognitive overload in our brain and simply just have more capacity to handle the challenges that life will throw at us anyway. The second point to reflect on is the issue of gratitude. So gratitude is all about accepting, and as line 44 tells us, rejoicing in the way things are. So let's just revisit that verse. Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. I think this is one of the key realizations of Taoism, rejoicing in the way things are and gaining power from acceptance and not always looking for more. So I've found a really good article online. I'll leave the link in the show notes, but it just talks through some of the academic research on gratitude and mental health. So combining a whole heap of studies, here's just some of the effects that gratitude can have on the brain. So it can foster cognitive restructuring by evoking positive thinking. Okay, we know in psychology that neurons that fire together wire together. So if you create pathways in your brain through certain types of thinking, you'll be more likely to go down those pathways again in future. Okay, it's also been found that gratitude reduces fear and anxiety by regulating stress hormones. So there's actually a hormonal effect of practicing gratitude. And from a chemical perspective, it can enhance dopamine and serotonin. And these neurotransmitters we know are very much related, if not responsible, for happiness. So these are just a few findings. Okay, the Mindfulness Awareness Research Center, which is a part of UCLA, stated that gratitude does change the neural structures of the brain and actually can make us feel more happy and content. And it's interesting, there's a model here that I'll share in the show notes that talks about gratitude feeding into different facets of human life that then really lead to what they call true happiness. So gratitude can foster optimism, selflessness, spirituality, empathy, and self-esteem. And all of these factors combine to create true happiness within us. And gratitude has been described by some psychologists as a natural antidepressant. So it's very likely you've heard of gratitude journaling. It's a practice that I've tried myself, and I'm sure many of you have, and I think is incredibly beneficial. I would argue mainly for the perspective it gives. Many of us, myself included, we can often become bogged down in negative perspectives if we allow ourselves to. And I think practicing gratitude is certainly not delusional. It's not to say there aren't things in your life that you shouldn't want to change. It's actually about increasing your perspective on life. So you can say, okay, yes, there are these negatives here, but I also have many positive things to be grateful for. So I think Taoism reminding us that we should rejoice in the way things are is very potent in that regard. So why gratitude? Why is gratitude related to Taoism? I mean, firstly, we've got the verse 44 that explicitly mentions gratitude or rejoicing in the way things are, which I would argue is a type of gratitude. But also, I think gratitude is kind of the opposite of craving and desire. So if craving is to be defined as a state of wishing for or longing for something you do not currently have in your life, then gratitude surely is the antidote. So rejoicing in the way things are, being grateful for what you have, for the earth beneath your feet, for your life, for the people around you, these are practices that are the antithesis of desire, because I think it's easy when we fight craving and desire to get caught in a loop. You can desire to not have desire, right? And you can just get caught in a loop. And it's often, I'm very guilty of this, you can just become over intellectualizing or over cognizant, making things too much of a mental process, and that has its limits. However, if you're just able to move into a completely different brain state, which is gratitude, you can't really feel lacking whilst you're feeling gratitude. So I think that's very much why it's related to Taoism. Lastly, I'll talk about what is the most intense form of craving and desire. It might be addiction. And addiction, looping cycles of wishing for a substance or a thing or a feeling that we had once and we're never quite satisfied. We always want more. It can be thought of as a hungry ghost mentality from a Buddhist perspective. But we know addictions, we don't have to go into the research on that. They can be destructive to everyone around us and ourselves. So there's no point dwelling too much on that. But surely by seeing that the most extreme form of craving is addiction, we can then still see how lesser forms can harm us, even if they're not full-blown addictions. So we've established that the craving form of desire is seen as something that we need to let go of within Taoism so we can fully experience the Tao and experience our natural condition. However, you might fairly ask, well, how do I let go of desire? It seems to be a natural part of life. It seems to be something I experience. What tools does Taoism give us from a philosophy perspective to still perform the tasks we need to in life without desire? And the answer in Taoism is Wu Wei. So I'll read you the chapter from my book on Wu Wei, and then we'll dive in further. Acting with no expectations, leading and not trying to control. This is the supreme virtue. Tao Te Ching, verse 10. Acting without expectations. That's the key here. Wu Wei can be roughly translated as effortless action or action without desire or even non-action. However, I think the best translation might be something like effortless action or acting without friction. The idea is that an action is best performed in a state of flow in which there is no mental desire to reach an outcome. Rather, there is a focus on being absorbed in the task itself. So, for example, a farmer might plant his seeds and eagerly water them and watch them with a firm idea in his mind of the need to produce his goal, the desired crop, the need to make the right amount of money from the crop, the need to sell to XY person. However, these extra desires under a Taoist understanding, although very much irrational, remove him from the way. To perform this action with Wu Wei, one would simply plant the seeds, nurture them with no thought of the end product, being focused on each stage of the growth. The interesting thing is the outcome will still be the same, right? As humans, we don't affect an end product by focusing on the end product. We affect it by focusing on the current stage of growth. So the necessary action of tending to seeds will still be performed. And when done with Wu Wei in mind, the act of farming would become less stressful. And in fact, actually, the farmer would be more likely to tend the seed better, as he'll be more focused on the present moment and noticing that the seeds and their surrounding conditions rather than focusing on an imagined end goal. So the idea is, why waste further energy or mental focus on the outcome of an action rather than be totally with the action at hand? So Wu Wei doesn't mean not performing any action. That would lead to stagnation and would not be in accordance with nature. Nature flows, nature moves. It means to act in the moment, free of desire. Wu Wei also means to act without a sense of self, as the desire for an outcome is often understood to be ultimately rooted in our sense of ego and how it can benefit us. So to properly practice Wu Wei, Lao Tzu states that we must act without self and be part of a process of nature rather than in making ourselves individual aspects separate from nature. So Tao Te Ching, verse 55 tells us, he lets all things come and go effortlessly, without desire. He never expects results. Thus, he is never disappointed. Verse 63 tells us, the master takes action by letting things take their course. He remains as calm as at the end as at the beginning. He has nothing, thus he has nothing to lose. What he desires is non-desire. So these verses can be unpacked endlessly, but I think the key point here is being calm, using the minimal amount of effort needed, and not focusing on the future, focusing on the present, on the task, and seeing yourself as part of the totality of nature. And this is another theme we'll come on to in Taoism, but letting things take their course, verse 63, trusting that there is a process. You cannot own every stage of a process. You are interacting with an entire universe. So, as with most concepts in the Tao Te Ching, Wu Wei is centered on rhythms of nature. The concept is understood as a subtle and gentle way of activity which leads to working with less friction, stress, or anxiety. Verse 43 tells us, the gentlest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. That which has no substance enters where there is no space. This shows the value of non-action. So this touches on the theme of space and nothingness, which is core within Taoism, which we will focus on more later. But I think what we can realize is Taoism encourages us to realize there is an emptiness within our mind as well as a fullness, and these are polarities of nature that exist within us. And acting with Wu Wei encourages us to engage with emptiness. So Wu Wei may initially be seen as a contradiction in terms, and it has been a debate for hundreds or if not thousands of years between scholars. People often criticize Taoism for saying it encourages passivity, encourages inaction. And I think when we come on to discussing other aspects of Taoism, we can see why that is actually not the case. However, it is a fair point to make that it could lead to stagnation and lack of action if we don't see things within a totality of their whole. So verse 63 of the Tao Te Ching, which we just read, tells us, by taking action and letting things take their course, the master remains calm as at the end, as at the beginning. So calmness is a really important theme here. And we know that being calm is associated with lower heart rates, with lower stress, with a more balanced neurological state, more balanced immune system. There's only so much stress the body can take. And if we think of stress and calmness as two sides of the same continuum, Taoism definitely promotes calmness. So finding the ability to act without overly focusing on your desire or an outcome can really lead to us being more engaged with the action. I think it's that engaged brain state that is synonymous with being calm. So I'm sure many of us can imagine a time in our lives, whether it's playing sports or playing an instrument, where we've just had a really focused, locked in state of concentration that feels almost transcendent, feels calm. I think that might be getting close to what a state of Wu Wei is. Again, as I've mentioned, Taoism is all about using the least amount of energy needed on any given task. It's not about using no energy. It's not about stagnation. It's not about not doing anything. It's about not using excess energy so we can flow like nature. And again, we'll come on to discuss nature further. But let's just think of an analogy or an example. So imagine you're walking through a field of long grass and weeds, and you have really loose clothing on that is catching on the weeds and pulling at the threads and slowing you down. Now on top of that, you've got a heavy backpack on that's full of weights and water that's slowing you down. Now you can still walk through that field. You can still get to the other side. But if those heavy things in your backpacks are your worries and your stress and you're focusing on the future, and the threads on your clothing could represent clinging to an outcome or clinging to owning a process, you can still walk through the field. You can still get through your day, but it's going to use significantly more energy if you don't let go of those things. And acting with Wu Wei would be to walk through that field with more appropriate clothing and not wearing a heavy backpack. And you might just be able to glide through that field a bit easier. And guess what? You still get to the other side either way. Another theme here is the gentle overcoming the hard. So it says the gentlest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. I find, especially with men, but I'm sure across the board, over-identifying with rigid mental states, with fixated positions and points of view can be really detrimental to our mental health. It can lead us to stagnate on emotions and not really process or flow through them. It can lead to disagreements with other people. It can lead to neuroticism in extreme cases. All of these are forms of rigidness, of stiffness, of not moving. So when we allow things to be gentle, we actually allow for more movement, more growth, and actually being stronger. If you imagine in nature, a rigid, brittle tree is far more likely to be overblown by a storm than a tree that is able to flex in the wind. Again, this is more of a felt experience or mental state that is difficult to over-intellectualize or explain, but we can all relate to this. We can all relate to feeling more in flow in our lives. So again, the theme of gentleness overcoming rigid and stiffness is key to the concept of Wu Wei. Along with the concept of the Tao itself, Wu Wei is often described as the central paradox of Taoism. You know, how can you have effortless action? Surely action requires some effort. How can you have action with non-doing? These are paradoxes that take us back to the initial point of Taoism that I mentioned, that it's not something that can be intellectually grasped. It's not something that will necessarily fall within binary logic, yes or no. It's something you need to experience. And I would argue it's something that we can all experience when our perspective is in the right place. So that ends part 1 of our discussion on Taoism and mental health. I hope that's been enjoyable. We've skimmed over some concepts, we've introduced others, and we've done our best to integrate how Taoism can impact mental health. In part 2, we'll look at some further, more metaphysical concepts of Taoism, such as unity of opposites, relation to nature, and focus on peace and compassion. So that will be released within the next few weeks. I just wanted to close today's episode by reading a quote from a paper I found titled Taoism and its Impact on Mental Health of Chinese Communities. Now, we won't focus on the overall purpose of the paper, but there is just one line here, and I will leave the link to the paper that I think really encapsulates how Taoism relates to mental health, especially within this chat. So here we go. Taoism advocates self-transcendence, integration with the law of nature, inaction, and infinite frame of reference instead of social attainment, self-development, progressive endeavour, and personal interpretation. I think that's a really interesting and wide-ranging way of explaining the worldview and frame of reference that Taoism gives. And I really like the line about an infinite frame of reference. Taoism is all about integrating our frame of reference with the wider world, seeing ourselves as part of a cosmos, part of an unfolding, you might call it a plan, or you may at least call it an unfolding movement, and understanding that our own personal interpretation is just one way of looking at the world. So this might actually be seen as an antithesis to many kind of Western ways of thinking, to perhaps an antithesis towards existentialism to an extent, towards only forcing our will upon the world. Taoism is very much about seeing ourselves as part of nature, or at least acting in accordance with it. So I hope you've enjoyed that discussion, and we will follow up soon. In the meantime, I'll leave all of the links discussed in today's show notes, and we've got some super interesting guests coming up on the show soon from diverse backgrounds, such as the world of music, the world of druidry, and a few other places. So look forward to speaking with you again soon. Until next time.